The Denver sun was fatting behind jagged mountain peaks, casting the tarmac of Denver International Airport in a soft, golden haze. Passengers milled about, some sipping coffee, others scrolling through phones, earbuds in, completely absorbed in their own worlds. Flight 423 was boarding, a seemingly ordinary evening flight to Los Angeles, but for one passenger, the journey carried an invisible weight of preparation and anticipation. 17-year-old Sophie Ramirez sat quietly near the middle of the cabin, her backpack pressed against her lap. She was slender, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, eyes that seemed to flicker with a curiosity far older than her years. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like a typical teenager, nervous about flying, maybe a little bored, but beneath that ordinary exterior was a mind trained in precision, discipline, and focus. Sophie had spent years with flight simulators, reading manuals, memorizing every switch, gauge, and emergency procedure she could find online. She wasn't a pilot, not yet, but in her mind she was ready for anything. Her mother, Maria, slouched in her seat beside her, scrolling through Instagram, oblivious to the silent tension in Sophie's hands. Sophie's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, tracing the subtle curves and grooves of the plastic. She was aware of every sound in the cabin, the clattering of luggage in the overhead bins, the low hum of the air conditioning vents, the murmur of voices blending into a soft white noise. A voice crackled over the intercom, cheerful and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 423, non-stop to Los Angeles. We'll be departing shortly. Please fasten your seat belts and ensure all electronic devices are switched to airplane mode." The cabin responded with the usual mix of irritation and compliance. Sophie barely noticed. Her attention was elsewhere, scanning the cockpit door ahead, imagining the controls, imagining herself in the pilot's seat. It was more than a game. It was a mental rehearsal she had run thousands of times. Then it happened. A loud, jarring thump shook the plane. Not a bump on the runway, not turbulence, but a violent, unexpected shock that reverberated through the fuselage. Oxygen masks immediately dropped from the ceiling in a mechanical rush, swinging like pale pendulums above the heads of screaming passengers. The intercom crackled violently before the pilot's voice returned, this time tense, almost shaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an engine failure. Remain calm. Flight attendants prepare for emergency procedures." The cabin erupted. Panic surged like electricity through the aisles. People shouted to loved ones, some screamed, others froze, unable to comprehend the danger. Sophie's mother gripped her arm instinctively. "Sophie, what's happening?" she whispered, eyes wide with terror. Sophie's heart pounded, but instead of fear, a cold, intense clarity took over. Years of preparation, of discipline, of obsession with the mechanics of flight surged to the forefront of her mind. She had read every emergency manual, memorized procedures, practiced landing scenarios under worse conditions than this in her simulator. She knew what was happening. She knew what had to be done. A flight attendant ran past them, yelling at passengers to secure themselves. "Stay calm, brace positions, stay in your seats." Sophie glanced toward the cockpit door. It was locked, standard procedure, but her gaze didn't waver. She knew she had to get there. Then the co-pilot's voice cut through the static, breathless, full of raw panic. "We have 2 minutes left." The words hit Sophie like a thunderclap. 2 minutes. Not 5, not 10, 2 minutes. Enough time to act or enough time for everything to go wrong. The numbers burned in her mind. Her pulse raced. Every instinct screamed at her to move. Without hesitation, she bolted from her seat, ignoring shouts, ignoring the chaos around her. People screamed, children cried, and Sophie ran down the aisle with terrifying focus. Flight attendants tried to stop her. "You can't," one began, but Sophie brushed past them, adrenaline propelling her forward. Her mother called out, "Sophie, wait." But the words were drowned by the roar of alarms and screaming passengers. Sophie didn't look back. She could feel the plane lurch as turbulence rocked it violently, metal groaning, lights flickering. Her shoes scuffed against the carpeted aisle as she approached the cockpit door, her mind racing faster than her legs. She reached the door. It was locked electronically, as expected. Her hands fumbled with the keypad above the handle, an old override code she had memorized years ago from studying manuals. Her fingers flew over the numbers, each tap resonating like the tick of a countdown clock. Behind the door, she could hear the frantic voices of the pilots, the co-pilot shouting numbers, the plane's alarms screaming in unison. Smoke hissed faintly from a vent nearby, curling into the cockpit's edges. Finally, the lock clicked. Sophie pushed the door open and stepped into the cockpit. It was chaos incarnate. Red warning lights flashed across the panels. Sparks jumped from the left console. The pilot, a middle-aged man with graying hair plastered to his forehead by sweat, was frantically flipping switches, pressing buttons, and muttering calculations under his breath. The co-pilot was shouting coordinates, panic thick in his voice. The plane lurched violently, threatening to tip sideways. For a heartbeat, Sophie froze. She had never actually been in a cockpit during a real emergency. She had only imagined it, trained for it, lived it in simulations. But now it was real. Every decision here could mean life or death. "Step aside," she yelled, voice sharp, cutting through the chaos. The pilots turned toward her, stunned. She could see the disbelief in their eyes. She was just a girl, barely 17, yet her eyes held something they hadn't seen: absolute, unwavering focus. "I know what to do," she shouted. "Just give me the controls." The pilot hesitated, glancing at the co-pilot. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the alarms and the roar of the engines. The co-pilot, eyes wide with fear and desperation, finally nodded. "Do it, just do it." Sophie's hands flew to the controls. Every switch, every lever, every button was familiar. Years of practice and countless virtual landings surged into action. She adjusted the throttle, tilted the plane, and began stabilizing it midair, every motion precise and calculated. Sparks continued to flare from the dashboard, alarms screamed, and the plane jolted like a living beast in pain. But Sophie remained centered, her focus absolute. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was a chaotic swirl of twilight, storm clouds, and city lights growing in the distance. Thunder rumbled ominously and the plane swayed violently. She could see passengers screaming, grasping armrests, holding children. But there was no time for panic. Not for her. Not now. 2 minutes, that was all she had. And with that, Sophie Ramirez, a 17-year-old girl with a passion for flight simulators and the memory of a father she'd lost too soon, took command of a plane full of lives. Suspense hook. Could a teenager actually save an entire plane in just 2 minutes? Or was this the moment they would all regret boarding Flight 423? Sophie's heart hammered in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing in her ears louder than the alarms screaming across the cockpit. The plane jolted violently, throwing her forward against the controls, sparks crackling from the dashboard like miniature fireworks. Her eyes darted across the panels, scanning warning lights and gauges. Red, 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 every indicator flashing a code for imminent disaster. The pilot, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a salt and pepper beard, froze when he saw her step in. Who are you?" he demanded, voice thick with disbelief and panic. "I'm Sophie Ramirez," she said, steady despite the chaos. "I know how to fly this plane, you have to trust me." The co-pilot's hands hovered in the air, hesitant. We don't have a choice," he said, voice barely above a whisper, panic threading every word. 2 minutes, we have 2 minutes." Sophie swallowed hard, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had trained for this in simulations, yes, but simulations never screamed, never shook violently midair, never had hundreds of terrified souls depending on her hands. Yet something inside clicked. Fear is a luxury she couldn't afford. She slammed her hands onto the yoke. "I need you both to follow my lead. Keep communicating, but don't touch anything unless I tell you to. Can you do that?" "Yes," the pilot muttered, disbelief still shadowing his voice. The cockpit shuddered as the plane hit turbulence. Lightning slashed across the sky outside the windshield, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers in quick, fleeting flashes. Sparks erupted from the malfunctioning left engine panel, curling like smoke snakes along the console. Sophie's mind raced. She had mere moments to assess the situation and act. First priority, stabilize the plane. She pushed the throttle, correcting the tilt from the turbulence, her fingers flying across buttons and levers as if guided by instinct alone. She spoke calmly, more to herself than anyone else. Left engine is failing, right engine holding, fuel gauge normal, landing gear not yet okay. The co-pilot repeated numbers she gave him, his voice trembling. Altitude 5000, vertical speed descending, speed too fast. The plane lurched violently again, nearly tipping sideways. Sophie gritted her teeth, forcing her focus. She had to keep the wings level, keep the nose from dipping, or the plane would spin out of control. Behind her, the cabin erupted in screams. A woman clutched her child so tightly the baby's cries became muffled wails. Men and women shouted instructions to one another, some standing, some gripping armrests so hard their knuckles were white. Sophie barely noticed. The only world that mattered was the cockpit, the controls, the plane, and 2 minutes. Her gaze flicked to the left engine. Smoke was curling more aggressively now. Sparks hissed like live wires. She pressed a switch, trying to cut power to the failing engine. Sparks flared brighter, smoke intensified, and the plane lurched violently again. A wave of nausea hit her, but she pushed it aside. Panic was contagious. She couldn't allow herself to succumb. "Flaps adjust," she said, almost mechanically reaching for the lever. "Reduce speed, stabilize yaw, engage manual control." The co-pilot moved quickly, hands trembling but obedient. He repeated each command to the pilot, who followed cautiously, allowing Sophie to take the lead. The cockpit was a whirlwind of activity, but Sophie's mind was a calm center, a still lake amidst the storm. A stewardess's voice cut through the intercom, trembling. "Passengers, remain seated. Brace positions. We are fighting for stability." Sophie's mother's face flashed before her eyes. Maria's wide, terrified eyes, her hands clutching Sophie's, begging her to stay safe. Not now, Sophie thought. I can't think about fear, only control. Suddenly, the plane jolted violently again, more severe than before. A loud bang echoed from the fuselage. One of the overhead compartments had burst open, sending a bag sliding down the aisle, narrowly missing a screaming toddler. Oxygen masks swung wildly above them. The pilot swore under his breath, This is a nightmare." Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. She had to act faster. Time was slipping. 2 minutes weren't enough to fix everything, but it was enough to prevent total disaster if she moved precisely. Her eyes flicked to the digital altitude readout, 3,200 feet. The runway was still miles away. Wind gusts buffeted the fuselage. She could see the city lights of Los Angeles in the distance, glowing through the storm clouds like embers in a night sky. "Approach angle 20 degrees, throttle steady, compensate for left engine drift." Okay, Sophie muttered, almost whispering, more like a mantra than instructions. Suddenly, the plane shuddered again, violently, throwing her against the controls. Sparks flew from the dashboard, small fires licking the edges of wires. She could feel the heat, smell the ozone and the burning insulation. Her throat was dry, her hands sweaty, but she refused to let panic take over. The co-pilot's voice quivered. "Sophie, we're losing altitude fast." Her stomach dropped. She glanced out the windshield. The mountains were closer than she wanted them to be. She had to pull up fast. Fingers dancing over switches, she adjusted the yoke, countering the plane's dip, fighting against gravity, fighting against the failing engine. A jolt of adrenaline surged through her. This was it. This was the moment all those nights in the simulator had prepared her for. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, the words he had told her countless times before he died. "Stay calm. Trust your instincts. You can handle this." She gritted her teeth. "Throttle up, stabilize, hold steady." Her words were commands and prayers at the same time. Outside, the storm raged. Lightning cracked like a whip across the clouds, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers in fleeting glimpses. The left engine coughed violently, sparks flashing. Smoke curled toward the cockpit, but Sophie ignored it, focused on one thing: keeping the plane level, keeping it alive, keeping everyone alive. Suddenly, the co-pilot gasped. "The landing gear, it's not deploying properly." Sophie's eyes widened. She had seen this in simulations. A malfunctioning landing gear could send the plane skidding off the runway, or worse, flipping it entirely. But she had a split second to decide, and split-second decisions were her specialty. "Listen to me," she said sharply. "Manual override for the landing gear. Pull lever now." The co-pilot followed her instructions, hands shaking, and a loud mechanical groan echoed as the gear began to descend. Sparks flew again from the failing panel, smoke thickened, and alarms screamed louder than ever. "Almost there, keep it steady," Sophie muttered, voice calm but firm. Every ounce of training, every simulation run, every imagined emergency prepared her for this. Her mind was laser-focused, blocking out fear, ignoring the chaos around her. The pilot's jaw was clenched, disbelief etched into his face. I can't believe this. A child is doing what we could." The plane lurched violently again. 2 minutes. 1 minute. Sophie's pulse felt like it would explode from her chest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The runway was visible now, a thin strip of light slicing through the storm clouds below. Sparks, smoke, and chaos surrounded her, but for the first time, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Suspense hook. The runway is in sight, but the plane is damaged, the engine failing, and the landing gear uncertain. Can a 17-year-old girl actually land a plane in the middle of a storm and survive? Sophie's hands flew across the cockpit controls, each movement precise yet lightning fast. Sparks continued to erupt from the failing left engine, curling into the smoke-filled cabin like fiery serpents. She pressed switches, twisted dials, and toggled levers with a speed and accuracy that belied her age. Her fingers felt like extensions of the plane itself. Every decision, every motion was instantaneous and critical. The co-pilot's eyes were wide, filled with disbelief, fear, and a strange flicker of awe. She's actually doing it," he muttered under his breath. The pilot, pale and soaked in sweat, nodded slowly, almost unable to comprehend what was happening. For the first time in decades of flying, these seasoned aviators were watching someone younger than their passengers take command with more skill and composure than they themselves could muster. Outside the cockpit, the storm raged with merciless intensity. Lightning cracked like whips across the sky, illuminating the clouds in eerie white flashes. The plane lurched violently as a gust of wind pushed it sideways, shaking the fuselage like a leaf in a hurricane. Sophie adjusted the yoke, her fingers gripping it like a lifeline. "Compensate for lateral drift. Hold altitude, she muttered, voice calm but forceful. The cabin was chaos incarnate. Passengers screamed, some crying, some clutching children, others pressing themselves into seats as if that would protect them. The stewardesses shouted instructions over the din, their voices cracking but resolute. "Brace! Brace positions! Stay calm!" Sophie barely noticed. The world outside the cockpit window was all that mattered. Then came another jolt. The plane tilted dangerously to the left. Sparks erupted from the left engine's panel, and smoke curled thicker toward the ceiling. Sophie's stomach dropped. She could feel the heat radiating from the electronics. One wrong move now could send the plane into an uncontrolled spin. She swallowed her fear and pushed herself harder. Throttle steady, rudder correct, stabilize wings. Her voice was a mantra. She adjusted the plane's pitch, compensating for the failing engine and erratic winds. Sweat ran down her face, but her eyes remained locked on the instruments. Every flicker of a gauge, every tiny movement of the yoke, every tremor in the plane was noted and corrected instantly. The co-pilot spoke up, voice trembling. "We're losing altitude faster than expected, runway, still miles away. This is going to be tight." Sophie didn't flinch. She had calculated scenarios like this countless times. Years of flight simulators, crash course manuals, and late-night sessions had trained her mind to anticipate every variable. "We'll make it," she said, more to convince herself than anyone else. "Compensate for turbulence. Engage manual override for stabilizers. Okay, we can do this." Outside, lightning illuminated a terrifying view. The city of Los Angeles sprawled below like a web of lights in the storm, yet it felt impossibly distant. Clouds whipped past at breakneck speed, and the plane continued to shudder violently with each gust of wind. Sophie's pulse was rapid, but her mind was razor-sharp. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the pilot. Suddenly, a new challenge emerged. The flaps, critical for controlling lift during descent, had malfunctioned due to the storm's electrical surge. The left engine groaned, a low, ominous rumble warning of imminent failure. Sophie's eyes flicked to the gauge. She had seconds to decide: attempt to compensate manually or risk losing control entirely. "Manual flaps," she commanded, reaching for the lever. Sparks flew from the dashboard, smoke stinging her eyes. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to stay calm. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. She had to act quickly. "Engage right engine throttle, hold altitude. Adjust pitch to 20 degrees, yes, yes, good." She whispered instructions to herself while coordinating with the co-pilot and pilot, who were now fully following her lead. The co-pilot's hands moved frantically, toggling switches and repeating Sophie's commands, his voice tight with tension. A sudden alarm blared, landing gear malfunction. Sophie's stomach sank. She had seen this in simulations, but simulations never carried the weight of real lives. The plane's descent was critical. A failed landing gear could mean catastrophe. "Pull lever for manual landing gear override now," she shouted. The co-pilot complied, his fingers trembling. A loud mechanical groan reverberated through the cabin. Sparks flew, smoke thickened, and the plane tilted slightly as the gear began its descent. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. Every second was a battle, every movement a potential difference between life and death. "Hold steady, steady, steady," she muttered. Outside, the city lights were clearer now, stretching toward the horizon like a fragile ribbon of hope. She could see the runway through a veil of storm clouds, a faint glow in the darkness. It was a small target, yet her focus never wavered. The pilot muttered, voice filled with awe and fear. "I've flown for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Sophie didn't respond. There was no time for words. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, clear and steady, guiding her. "Trust your instincts. Stay calm. You can handle this." His memory anchored her. She drew in a deep breath and locked onto the runway, imagining herself in the simulator thousands of nights ago, running the exact same sequence of maneuvers. Suddenly, a sharp jolt nearly threw her against the controls. Lightning illuminated the cabin, and passengers screamed in unison, clutching each other in terror. Sophie forced herself to focus, each motion deliberate, precise. She adjusted the throttle, corrected the tilt, stabilized the wings, and engaged every manual override she had studied in preparation for this exact type of emergency. Her mind moved faster than lightning. She calculated descent rates, wind angles, turbulence patterns, and the failing engine's diminishing output simultaneously. Every fraction of a second mattered. The plane groaned under the strain, metal screaming, but Sophie remained the calm eye in the storm. "Flaps okay, gear deployed, runway in sight, yes," she whispered. The runway lights were now fully visible, stretching like a golden ribbon through the darkness, shimmering with rain and turbulence. The co-pilot gasped. She's actually doing it. She's bringing us home." The pilot nodded, silent, jaw tight, eyes wide. Neither could fully comprehend the gravity of the moment. Sparks danced from the cockpit console again, smoke swirling around Sophie's face. She could taste the metallic tang in the air, feel the vibrations of the failing engine beneath her fingertips, hear the alarms screaming like banshees around her. And yet, amidst all this chaos, she remained focused. Approach angle, adjust, compensate for left drift, steady, steady. Every command, every adjustment was critical. The plane tilted once more, dangerously close to rolling. Sophie corrected it instantly. Her mind was a machine, processing thousands of variables in real time. Just a little further, hold, hold. She could see the end of the runway approaching, glowing faintly through the storm. Sweat stung her eyes, her hands ached from gripping the yoke, but there was no time to pause. Suspense hook. Sophie is in full control. The runway is in sight, but the plane is damaged, engines failing, and every second brings new danger. Could a 17-year-old girl actually land a plane under conditions that would terrify even the most seasoned pilots? The plane shuddered violently, each gust of wind slamming it like a toy against invisible hands. Lightning cut across the sky, illuminating the cockpit in brief, blinding flashes. Sparks from the left engine panel jumped again and smoke thickened, curling toward the ceiling. Every warning light screamed for attention, and still, Sophie sat at the controls, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked on the horizon. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. She hadn't heard it in years, not since that day when she was 8 and he died in a crash during a training exercise. But now, in the cockpit with the lives of hundreds on the line, his voice was clear and sharp, as if he were sitting beside her. Stay calm. Always trust your instincts. Control the plane, control yourself. Sophie swallowed, clenching the yoke. The memory of him teaching her how to read instruments, how to anticipate turbulence, how to make split-second decisions under pressure, surged through her like a lifeline. Every lesson she had ever learned from him, the way he would guide her hands on the simulator yoke, the way he would whisper corrections, was coming alive now, guiding her in the most real way possible. The co-pilot's voice trembled. Altitude dropping too fast, 2,500 feet, runway still miles away. Sophie's stomach dropped. She could see the runway lights faintly through the storm, but it was far, too far. The left engine was sputtering dangerously. Sparks flew like firecrackers from the damaged panel. She knew she couldn't rely on autopilot, it had failed earlier. She was flying entirely by instinct, entirely by memory, entirely on the edge of human capability. Flaps, manual control, throttle steady. Adjust pitch to 20 degrees, stabilize steady, she muttered, each word measured, each movement precise. Her hands were slick with sweat, her fingers raw from gripping the yoke. Every motion mattered. The pilot cleared his throat, voice tight with fear and awe. I've flown every emergency scenario imaginable. Nothing prepares you for this. She's actually handling it. The plane lurched again. Sparks from the left engine panel hissed and danced. Smoke filled the cockpit, stinging Sophie's eyes, but she refused to blink, refused to lose focus. She could feel every vibration in the plane, every tremor, every shift of weight. Her senses were alive, hyper-aware, as though the plane and she were one organism fighting against the storm. A flash of memory hit her suddenly, her father during a late-night simulator session, guiding her hands over the throttle as a virtual engine failed mid-flight. Don't panic. Feel the plane. Let it tell you what to do. Sophie breathed deeply, letting those words anchor her. She could feel the plane now, the weight of the fuselage, the imbalance of the engines, the subtle shifts in air pressure. She adjusted the yoke, compensating for the failing left engine, pushing the throttle to maximum on the right. The plane stabilized, tilting slightly, but not enough to send them into chaos. The co-pilot swallowed audibly. She's controlling it, she's really doing it. But then came a new danger. The landing gear indicator had malfunctioned. Sophie's stomach clenched. Without proper landing gear deployment, the plane could skid off the runway, flip, or worse. Her hands flew to the emergency manual override. Manual override now, she shouted. The co-pilot complied, fingers shaking as the gear began its slow descent. Sparks continued to fly from the console, smoke thickened, alarms screamed louder. Sophie's chest burned as she fought the controls, adjusting pitch, roll, and speed. Outside, lightning illuminated the city below, glinting off skyscrapers, streets, and the wet runway. Rain lashed against the fuselage like icy needles. Every passenger on board was screaming, praying, gripping loved ones, completely unaware that the person controlling their fate was barely older than a child. Sophie could feel panic creeping in, not her own, but the panic of the hundreds of lives she was responsible for. She swallowed, forcing herself to calm, repeating her father's mantra over and over. Stay calm. Trust your instincts. Control the plane, control yourself. Her mind calculated every variable: wind speed, altitude, engine output, angle of approach. Every number had to be perfect. One misstep and the plane could roll, skid, or break apart on impact. She adjusted the yoke slightly, countering the gusts pushing the plane sideways. The left engine groaned under the strain, threatening to fail completely. She glanced at the pilot. His hands hovered near the controls, almost paralyzed by disbelief. You've got this," he asked, voice tight. Sophie didn't answer. There was no time. The runway lights were closer now, but the storm wasn't done with them. Another violent gust slammed the plane, throwing it dangerously off course. Sparks erupted from the left panel. Smoke filled her nose and stung her eyes. She clenched her teeth. Hold steady, flaps, manual control, throttle full, stabilize. Her voice was a lifeline not just for herself, but for the plane, the pilots, the crew, and the passengers. A flash of lightning revealed the terrified faces of passengers through the cabin windows. A mother clutched her child tightly. A man gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles were white. Sophie could hear cries, screams, and prayers blending into a single, terrifying soundscape. She couldn't think about them, couldn't let fear enter her mind. She focused entirely on the runway. Each second was a battle, every movement of the controls a fight for survival. Her hands flew across levers, toggled switches, and pressed buttons as if guided by a higher instinct. Sparks continued to fly from the failing engine panel, smoke thickened, and yet she remained unshakable. Then came the realization that made her heart pound like a drum. She could feel the plane slipping from her grasp. The left engine was almost dead. The right engine was carrying too much of the burden. Turbulence was worse than anything she had simulated. She had never faced this combination of failures, this intensity of danger. Not in simulations, not in dreams. This was real. But she also felt something else, a surge of determination, a clarity born from necessity. She wasn't just flying a plane. She was fighting for hundreds of lives, for her mother, for every person on that plane, for herself. Sophie took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and repeated the mantra again. Stay calm. Trust your instincts. Control the plane, control yourself. The runway lights grew larger, closer, piercing through the storm like a beacon of hope. Sparks hissed from the left engine, smoke curling thicker than ever, alarms screaming, but Sophie remained a calm center in the storm. Her father's lessons, her countless hours in simulations, her obsession with flying, they were all converging now, guiding her hands, steadying her heart. She whispered to herself, barely audible over the roar of wind and engines. Almost there, just a little further, hold. Suspense hook. The runway is visible, the storm rages, the engines are failing, and the landing gear is partially malfunctioning. Sophie must confront her deepest fears and rely entirely on her instincts. Can she guide the plane safely to the runway, or is disaster inevitable? The runway lights of Lowe's Angels were now clear through the storm, stretching like a faint, fragile ribbon of hope across the darkness. But the plane was battered, groaning under the strain of a failing left engine, and the gusting winds that refused to relent. Sparks from the malfunctioning console continued to hiss into the cockpit, curling like angry snakes, and smoke filled the small space, stinging Sophie's eyes and lungs. Every instrument was lit with red warnings. each one a reminder that time was slipping through her fingers. Sophie's pulse raced, but her expression remained calm, almost eerily so. She gripped the yoke with white-knuckled determination, adjusting the plane's pitch, roll, and yaw as if they were extensions of her own body. The co-pilot and pilot sat frozen beside her, terrified but obedient, hands hovering over the controls, watching in awe as the teenager who should have been their passenger guided them towards survival. "Flaps manual," Sophie whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the roar of wind and engine alarms. "Throttle steady, adjust descent, hold heading, hold heading." The plane lurched violently as a sudden gust struck from the side, tilting the fuselage dangerously. Sparks erupted from the left panel and smoke billowed thicker. Sophie's stomach dropped, but she refused to panic. She drew on every lesson, every memory of her father guiding her through late-night simulator flights, every scenario she had studied. Stay calm. Trust your instincts. Control the plane, control yourself. A voice broke through the chaos. The co-pilot's voice trembled. She's really doing it. Runway, still far, and we're descending too fast, we might not make it." Sophie's teeth clenched. The plane was losing altitude faster than planned. Rain pelted the windshield in relentless sheets, reducing visibility to almost zero. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers below. Mothers clutched children, men held onto seats so tightly their knuckles were white. And all of them were trusting her, a 17-year-old girl, with their lives. She adjusted the yoke slightly, compensating for the failing left engine, tilting the plane's nose just enough to slow the descent without stalling. Sparks continued to pop from the console, the smell of burning metal thick in the air. She reached for the throttle, nudging it forward to counteract the drag and maintain speed, her fingers moving instinctively. The runway was closer now. She could see it through the rain and clouds, a faint glowing strip in the stormy darkness. But the approach wasn't straight. It never was. Wind gusts pushed from both sides, threatening to push the plane off course. The left engine was sputtering, coughing, on the verge of complete failure. One wrong move, one delay, and the plane could spiral out of control. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, guiding her through the chaos. "Always feel the plane, trust what it tells you, adjust before it's too late." Sophie exhaled slowly, centering herself. She felt the plane now, the subtle vibrations, the angle of tilt, the weight shift as the engine struggled. It was almost like the aircraft was alive and she was listening to it. "Adjust rudder, compensate for drift, steady, steady, hold altitude." Her words were both mantra and command, keeping herself and the plane synchronized. Sparks flared again, smoke curling toward the ceiling. A warning light blinked furiously, signaling the left engine was barely operational. Suddenly, another danger appeared. The landing gear indicator flickered, uncertain if the wheels were fully deployed. Panic rose in Sophie's chest, but she pushed it aside. She reached for the manual override lever again, pulling it with a practiced hand. The gear responded slowly, a mechanical groan echoing through the cabin. Sparks hissed and smoke thickened, but she adjusted pitch and throttle to compensate. The pilot whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. "She's bringing us home, a child. She's actually doing it." Sophie didn't answer. No time, she had to focus. Her mind calculated everything at once: speed, altitude, engine output, wind gusts, distance to the runway, angle of descent. Every variable was critical. Every second mattered. She could not afford a single misstep. "Hold steady, steady. Line up with runway, correct drift. Yes, yes." She could see the runway more clearly now, glimmering like a beacon through the storm. The plane responded to her commands, tilting slightly as she corrected for gusts of wind, adjusting flaps manually to maintain lift while keeping the descent gradual. The co-pilot gasped. She's actually doing it, aligning for landing." A sudden, violent gust slammed the plane, forcing Sophie to react instantly. She twisted the yoke, countering the tilt, nudged the throttle forward, adjusted the flaps manually, and whispered under her breath, Come on, sparks erupted from the left panel, and smoke now filled her peripheral vision. Sweat stung her eyes, her arms ached, but she refused to stop. Every movement, every calculation was precise. The runway lights were now almost beneath them. Rain pelted the windshield, wind buffeted the fuselage, and the left engine was sputtering dangerously. Sophie knew she had only one chance, one perfect approach, one flawless landing, or everything would end in catastrophe. Her father's words echoed again, steady and guiding. Trust yourself, trust the plane, trust your instincts. You can do this. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, centering herself, then opened them laser-focused. She adjusted the throttle, corrected the rudder, leveled the wings, and guided the plane closer to the runway. Sparks from the failing engine hissed and flared. Smoke curled thicker, and the alarm screamed, but she remained the calm center of the storm. Passengers screamed and prayed, some gripping seats, others crying silently, but Sophie didn't see them, didn't hear them. Only the runway mattered, only control, only survival. The plane's nose dipped slightly as she began the final approach. She adjusted flaps and throttle simultaneously, countering the failing left engine's drag. The landing gear was partially deployed but functional. Every fraction of a second was critical. She had trained for moments like this, yes, but never under real life or death stakes. Sophie's pulse raced, but her movements were controlled. The runway lights grew larger, stretching beneath them, offering a fragile promise of safety. She could see the wet tarmac reflecting the stormy sky, a slick mirror that demanded perfect precision. One wrong tilt, one miscalculation, and the plane could skid off, roll, or worse. Hold steady, almost there," she whispered, guiding the plane closer inch by inch, breath by breath. Sparks hissed, smoke swirled, wind battered them, and still she remained focused, a calm, determined force amidst chaos. Suspense hook. The runway is within reach, the plane is damaged, and the storm shows no mercy. Sophie's next moves will determine whether hundreds of lives survive or are lost in an instant. Can a 17-year-old girl make the impossible landing? The runway was no longer a distant ribbon of light. It was beneath them now, wet and glistening in the storm, a fragile strip of hope against the chaos surrounding Flight 423. Sophie's heart raced, but her movements were calm, precise, and deliberate. Every ounce of training, every lesson from her father, every hour spent at the simulator converged in this one moment. The plane lurched violently as a gust of wind hit from the side, nearly throwing it off course. Sparks continued to erupt from the failing left engine, and smoke curled thickly, stinging her eyes and lungs. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. Hold steady, flaps, landing gear, check. The co-pilot's voice quavered. Runway, we're so close, but the left engine, she's barely holding it. Sophie didn't flinch. She adjusted the throttle to compensate, nudging the right engine to give the plane extra lift while manually stabilizing the wings. The landing gear, partially deployed but functional, groaned under the weight of the aircraft as it absorbed the plane's descent. Sparks hissed again from the dashboard, smoke curling like dark ribbons around her. Outside, the storm raged. Rain lashed against the windshield, lightning illuminated the horizon, and thunder shook the fuselage. The runway lights reflected in the wet tarmac below, distorted by the sheets of rain like a fragile promise that demanded perfect precision. One miscalculation, one tilt too much, one faltering decision, and the plane could skid off, flip, or break apart entirely. Sophie's mind moved faster than the storm. She calculated descent rates, wind angles, turbulence, and engine output simultaneously. Each adjustment had to be instantaneous, precise, and flawless. She could feel the plane beneath her hands, every vibration, every subtle shift in weight, every whisper of air pressure. She could feel the aircraft as if it were an extension of her own body. Approach angle check, descent rate, check, landing gear steady, she whispered, her voice taut with concentration. The plane responded to her commands with a fragile obedience, tilting slightly as she countered each gust and adjusted for the failing left engine. The co-pilot gasped. She's bringing us down. She's actually going to land us." The pilot nodded silently, jaw tight, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. Sparks flared once more from the left engine panel. Smoke swirled into the cockpit, thickening with each passing second. Sophie's hands were slick with sweat, muscles screaming, but she refused to relent. The lives of 180 passengers and crew hung on her every movement. A violent gust slammed the plane again, tilting it dangerously. Sophie's stomach dropped, but she adjusted instantly, nudging the yoke, fine-tuning the throttle, stabilizing the wings. The plane shuddered, but she held it. The runway lights were now clear, the wet tarmac reflecting in fleeting flashes as lightning illuminated the storm. Almost there," she muttered, guiding the plane closer inch by inch. Sparks hissed, alarms screamed, smoke swirled. The left engine coughed violently, struggling to keep pace with the right. Sophie adjusted the throttle, countering the imbalance. The plane tilted slightly as she corrected, nudged the flaps and held the descent steady. The landing gear made contact first, a loud, grinding thud that vibrated through the fuselage. The plane jolted violently, but Sophie kept it steady. She could feel the weight shift, the friction of the wet runway, the resistance of the partially functional landing gear. Sparks hissed one last time from the dashboard, and smoke filled the cockpit, but the plane was on the ground. Hold, steady," Sophie muttered, using every ounce of strength to keep the plane aligned with the runway. Tires screeched against the wet asphalt, friction burning as the aircraft skidded slightly. Rain lashed against the fuselage, lightning illuminating the chaos outside. The plane bounced slightly as the weight settled. Sophie adjusted the throttle to slow the descent gradually, carefully compensating for the failing left engine and the slick runway. Sparks erupted from the engine panel again, smoke curling thickly, but she remained focused, eyes locked on the runway ahead. Passengers screamed, cried, prayed, and clutched each other. Some had their eyes closed, some clung to seats, and others held children tightly. Sophie barely noticed. The world outside the cockpit didn't exist. There was only the plane, the runway, and the task at hand: bring everyone home safely. The plane continued to skid down the runway. The left engine groaned, the right engine roared, and the fuselage vibrated violently under the strain. Sparks hissed one last time from the console, and smoke filled the cockpit, but Sophie adjusted with precise, calculated movements. The plane straightened, tires squealing, flaps fully extended, landing gear holding, engine straining, but functional. The final stretch of the runway approached. Sophie nudged the throttle slightly, using the right engine to counterbalance the failing left. She adjusted the yoke, holding the plane perfectly aligned. The fuselage shuddered violently as friction burned against the wet tarmac. And then, finally, with a series of grinding thuds, the plane slowed, stabilizing completely. The storm still raged around them, rain pelting the fuselage, lightning illuminating the runway, but the plane was firmly on the ground. Sophie exhaled, a long, shaky breath. Her body trembled from exhaustion, adrenaline, and relief. Sparks fizzled out, smoke began to clear, and the alarms quieted. The co-pilot's voice broke the silence. "We were alive. She did it. She actually did it." The pilot sat back in awe, sweat dripping from his face. "I've flown for over 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she released the yoke. The plane had landed. They had survived. She looked out the windshield at the rain-slick runway, breathing hard, tears stinging her eyes. Outside the cabin, passengers erupted into cries of joy, relief, and disbelief. People hugged, sobbed, and shouted. Mothers clutched children, men lifted hands in prayer, and the flight attendants cried with relief. Sophie's mother ran toward the cockpit, tears streaming down her face. "Sophie, my baby, you saved us." Sophie's knees nearly buckled, but she steadied herself. She had done it. Against all odds, she had landed Flight 423. The plane had skidded, the engines were damaged, the landing gear compromised, but everyone was alive. The media had already begun broadcasting. Social media exploded with live videos, tweets, and streams. Teen girl lands plane in miraculous save. Flashes across screens worldwide. But Sophie didn't notice. All that mattered was that the lives entrusted to her were safe. The co-pilot finally exhaled, shaking. I can't believe this, she saved everyone. The pilot nodded silently, awe and gratitude etched across his face. Sophie allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but deep inside, she knew this wasn't the end. Questions awaited. Investigators, authorities, and the world would want answers. How had a 17-year-old girl managed to take control and land a plane under conditions that would terrify even the most experienced pilots? But for now, she let herself feel it. The rush of survival, the flood of relief, and the quiet, unspoken pride. She had done what no one thought possible. She had saved 180 lives. Suspense hook. The passengers were safe, but investigators and the media would soon arrive, and the world would demand answers. How did a teenager perform a feat that seemed impossible? And what consequences or recognition would follow? The rain had stopped, leaving the runway slick and glistening under the cold glow of the airport lights. Emergency crews swarmed Flight 423, but the moment the doors opened, the screams and cries of relief from the passengers overwhelmed everything. Hugs were exchanged, tears flowed freely, and hands trembled as people stepped onto the tarmac, grateful to be alive. Sophie sat in the cockpit, drenched, shaking, and exhausted. Her uniform was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the plane one last time to ensure it was safe. She barely noticed the crowd outside or the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Her mother knelt in the aisle, clutching her hands and sobbing. You saved everyone," Maria gasped, voice breaking. "You, my baby, you." Sophie's chest heaved. Words failed her. She had lived every second of the past terrifying hours as if in a dream, yet this reality, the relief, the fact that everyone had survived, felt surreal. She simply nodded, tears mixing with rain on her face. Outside, news crews were already setting up. Social media had erupted within minutes. Phone cameras captured passengers hugging, crying, laughing, and praying. Tweets were trending worldwide. Teen girl lands plane in storm, saves 180 lives, and Flight 423 miracle, teen pilot hero. Live streams of the tarmac were being broadcast globally. The co-pilot and pilot were escorted out by authorities, both visibly shaken. The veteran pilot had a hard time finding words. I've flown for decades. Nothing in my career prepared me for this," he said quietly, still staring at Sophie in disbelief. You actually saved us all." Sophie didn't respond immediately. Her mind was still processing, still anchored in the cockpit, still replaying the sequence of actions that had saved everyone. She was exhausted, but she felt a strange, surreal pride bubbling beneath the terror and adrenaline. The airport security team approached, cautious but urgent. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you immediately. Authorities and investigators want a statement." Sophie nodded. "Okay, I'll cooperate," she said softly, voice still trembling. Within minutes, she was escorted from the cockpit, surrounded by flashing cameras and microphones thrust into her face. Passengers surrounded her, thanking her, hugging her, and calling her a hero. Each moment felt overwhelming, yet Sophie kept moving, guided by instinct and the faint echo of her father's voice. "Stay calm. Focus. Do your job." Investigators quickly assembled near the aircraft, asking questions, taking notes, and scanning the plane for damage. Flight attendants and emergency crews were being interviewed, recounting the chaotic moments before Sophie had taken control. The story began to emerge like wildfire. A 17-year-old girl, passenger on Flight 423, had run to the cockpit during a full-blown emergency and landed the plane safely while the pilots and crew struggled. Journalists crowded around her. "How did you do it?" one asked. Did you have training? Another shouted. What was going through your mind? Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but words faltered. She didn't want to exaggerate. She had trained extensively, yes, but she had never imagined this would happen in real life. I just did what I had to do, she said finally, voice quiet but firm. I've trained, studied, I focused. I tried to stay calm and get everyone down safely. The media frenzy intensified. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, and social media exploded with hashtags, shares, and viral clips. Passengers' accounts flooded online. A teenage girl saved us. Flight 423 miracle. I can't believe a 17-year-old landed the plane in that storm. The pilot approached Sophie cautiously, emotion etched on his face. I don't know how to thank you, he said. His voice was low, almost reverent. You saved my life and everyone else. I've never seen anything like it. Sophie nodded, still processing. I just did what I had to do, she repeated. She felt both pride and a strange, lingering shock. She was exhausted emotionally and physically. Her body shook from the adrenaline dump, yet there was a quiet satisfaction, an unspoken recognition that she had done something extraordinary. As the authorities gathered statements, news crews broadcast live footage to the world. Social media exploded, and within hours, Sophie's story was trending worldwide. Her image, a small, drenched, determined teenager sitting in the cockpit, became iconic. Millions of people were mesmerized, inspired, and in disbelief. But the attention brought new tension. Investigators were methodical. Questions arose. How did a teenager have the knowledge to operate the cockpit? Were there safety violations? Could a minor legally take control of a commercial flight? The pilots and authorities spoke cautiously, knowing the public narrative would explode online. Meanwhile, passengers continued to gather around Sophie. You're a hero, one elderly woman said, holding her hand. You saved my granddaughter. Others wept, hugging her, expressing gratitude she hadn't anticipated. Each story, each emotion, anchored Sophie further in the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Sophie's mother stayed by her side, overwhelmed but proud. I never knew my daughter had this in her, Maria said softly. I've always known she was special, but this is incredible. Even the pilots, still recovering from the shock, began to speak publicly. The veteran pilot gave a statement to authorities. I've flown for decades, and I've never seen a passenger act with such clarity and precision under extreme duress. This young woman didn't just help us, she saved all of us, every life on that plane. Social media exploded further. Videos of Sophie in the cockpit, images of her drenched, focused, and commanding, were shared millions of times. News outlets ran segments analyzing the landing, praising her skill, and interviewing passengers who described her as a miracle. Hashtags like Teen Pilot Hero and Flight 423 Miracle dominated feeds worldwide. But amidst the recognition and awe, Sophie felt a mix of pride and unease. She had saved lives, yes, but the world now expected answers, explanations, and accountability. How had she performed feats that seemed impossible? How had a 17-year-old taken control of a plane in a storm and landed it safely? Authorities began formal interviews. Questions were asked about training, prior experience, mental preparedness, and how she had gained the knowledge to take control. Sophie answered honestly, explaining the countless hours of flight simulator practice, manuals she had studied, and the mental rehearsals she had run since childhood. She didn't embellish, but the truth was astonishing enough. This teenager had prepared herself for emergencies that even professional pilots had never faced at her age. As the day turned to night, the airport buzzed with media, investigators, and onlookers. Sophie was led to a quieter area to rest, surrounded by protective personnel and her mother. The world was watching, waiting for statements, interviews, and explanations. She felt the weight of the day pressing down, physically exhausted, mentally drained, and emotionally overwhelmed. Yet despite the exhaustion, one thought lingered in her mind. She had saved everyone on Flight 423. Against all odds, she had done the impossible, and now the world knew. Suspense hook. Sophie's heroism had been revealed, but the world's scrutiny was just beginning. Would she be celebrated as a national hero, or would authorities question how a teenager had achieved the impossible? The story was far from over. By the early morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving the city glistening under the soft glow of streetlights and airport floodlights. Flight 423 sat on the tarmac, surrounded by emergency crews and media personnel, but all eyes were on Sophie. She was escorted to a press area, still drenched from the cockpit, her uniform clinging to her small frame. The world was waiting for answers, for explanation, for a glimpse into the mind of the girl who had performed the impossible. Journalists crowded around, microphones thrust forward. Cameras flashed incessantly. Social media had exploded overnight. Clips of Sophie maneuvering the plane through the storm had gone viral, with millions sharing and commenting, hailing her as a teenage miracle and the girl who saved Flight 423. Sophie's mother stayed close, holding her hand, tears streaking her face. "You did it, Sophie. You really did it," Maria whispered. Her voice trembled, caught between pride and disbelief. Sophie nodded, still processing. Her hands were raw from gripping the controls, her body exhausted from adrenaline and stress, but her mind was racing with the events of the past hours. She remembered every second: the jolts, the sparks, the smoke, the panic of the passengers, the voices of the co-pilot and pilot, and her father's words guiding her through it all. Authorities approached, cameras briefly pushed aside. A senior investigator spoke with a measured tone. "Sophie, we need to verify the sequence of events. Can you explain what happened in the cockpit?" Sophie's voice was quiet but steady. The plane, it was losing altitude. The left engine was failing, flaps malfunctioning, landing gear partially stuck. The pilots were trying their best, but there wasn't enough time. I ran to the cockpit. I stabilized the plane, manually adjusted flaps and throttle, and guided it down. I focused on keeping everyone alive. The co-pilot standing beside her nodded in agreement. "She saved us all," he said simply. "Every move she made was precise, calculated. Without her, we wouldn't have made it." The veteran pilot added, voice heavy with awe, "I've flown for over 30 years, and I've never witnessed such skill, calmness, and precision in the cockpit. She's a natural, a miracle." The press erupted. Microphones were shoved forward, cameras zooming in. "How did you know what to do?" one reporter shouted. "Were you trained?" another asked. Sophie's answer was simple, honest, and astonishing. "I've studied flight simulators, manuals, and emergency procedures for years. I never expected this to happen in real life, but I just stayed calm and trusted my instincts." Outside the airport, social media exploded. Teen Pilot Hero and Flight 423 Miracle were trending worldwide. Millions of people shared the story, videos, and images, calling Sophie a national hero. Online, comments ranged from awe to disbelief. "A 17-year-old landed a plane in a storm. Unreal. This is the definition of bravery. Someone call Hollywood. This is a movie waiting to happen." Passengers began arriving at the press area, many crying, many hugging Sophie. An elderly woman pressed her hands together in gratitude. "You saved my granddaughter's life," she said, voice trembling. "I will never forget this." Another passenger, a man in his 40s, shook her hand firmly. "I don't know how to thank you. You were calm when all of us were terrified. You are a hero." Despite the overwhelming attention, Sophie remained humble. She smiled softly, shaking her head. "I just did what I had to do," she said quietly. "Anyone in my place would have done the same." The pilot spoke to reporters as well. The veteran pilot's voice was still thick with emotion. "She didn't just save the passengers, she saved us too. Every pilot dreams of being able to handle emergencies like that. She did it at 17. That's remarkable." Authorities began discussing formal recognition. News anchors speculated on awards, honors, and invitations from aviation organizations. Social media campaigns called for her to receive the Medal of Freedom. Her heroism transcended age, gender, and expectation. A teenager, barely old enough to drive, had performed a feat that defied logic, training, and probability. Yet amidst the accolades, Sophie remained focused on the people whose lives had depended on her. She walked through the plane once more, checking on passengers, smiling, comforting them. Children clung to her, calling her a hero. Adults wept, some embracing her as if she were family. She finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, letting the weight of what she had accomplished sink in. Later that day, Sophie and her mother were invited to a private press conference. Sophisticated cameras, microphones, and officials filled the room. Questions poured in, but Sophie's calm composure remained unshaken. She recounted her father's lessons, her years of preparation, and the intense focus that allowed her to guide the plane safely through the storm. "I was scared," she admitted, "but fear doesn't help in emergencies. You have to focus, follow your instincts, and take control. That's what I did, and I never gave up." Her words resonated far beyond the airport. Across the nation, people marveled at her bravery. Flight schools posted videos analyzing her landing, aviation experts praised her instincts, and social media celebrated her courage. Headlines read, "Teen hero lands plane, saves 180 lives," and "Sophie Ramirez, miracle of Flight 423." The pilots presented her with a small, informal medal they carried with them. "For your courage, skill, and quick thinking," the veteran pilot said. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. It was a simple gesture, but for her, it symbolized validation. She had faced the impossible and triumphed. Yet the story wasn't just about recognition, it was about hope. People everywhere were inspired by Sophie's courage, her calm under pressure, and her unwavering determination. Her story became a symbol that even in the darkest, most chaotic moments, one person, regardless of age, could make a difference. Sophie finally stepped outside, away from the press and the chaos. The storm had passed completely. The sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a golden glow across the airport. She inhaled deeply, feeling the fresh air on her face, and allowed herself a quiet smile. Her mother wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. "You're extraordinary," Maria whispered. "I've always known, but today, you've proven it to the world." Sophie nodded, letting herself relax for the first time in hours. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by relief, pride, and a profound sense of accomplishment. She had faced fear, chaos, and near-certain disaster, and emerged victorious. Later, at a small ceremony organized by the airline and authorities, Sophie was officially recognized for her bravery. Awards were presented, certificates signed, and photographs taken. She was celebrated not just as a hero, but as an example of courage, preparation, and the extraordinary potential within every individual. As the day wound down, Sophie reflected quietly. The storm, the sparks, the smoke, the terror, it all felt like a lifetime compressed into hours. Yet every memory, every second had shaped her into the person who could act when it mattered most. She thought of her father and whispered a silent thank you, knowing he would have been proud beyond words. Flight 423, once a scene of panic and near disaster, had become a story of heroism and hope. And at its center was Sophie Ramirez, a 17-year-old girl whose courage and skill had saved 180 lives. She had taken control when no one else could, faced fear head-on, and reminded the world that true heroism knows no age. Final suspense and emotional closure. Sophie's story would be told for years to come, inspiring millions. Yet she remained humble, quiet, and deeply human, a teenager who had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances and had answered the call. And even as accolades poured in and the world celebrated, Sophie knew one thing: courage isn't about being fearless. It's about taking control when fear surrounds you, and she had done exactly that.